Hello and good morning and afternoon, everyone. I'm recording this kind of early. Unfortunately, I won't be available this afternoon to chime in and like your posts on Packback. But anyway, so I do look for, and the TAs will start reading them later this week, and I'll introduce them probably in lecture next time. Okay, so today we are jumping into Chapter 4, looking at social cognition and basically how we think of things when we're in social situations. The sort of decisions we make, the judgments, what leads us to make the decisions we make, essentially, is what this is about. Now, what we often find, as this slide shows, social judgments are often inaccurate, and we find many examples of this in terms of bias and so on. And a lot of this, is very relevant to today. And I think, where everyone is sort of thinking in very stereotyped ways about other people, and I think we could go in a different direction, basically. So there's this famous social psychologist named Alex Todorov, and he basically showed, there's some early research looking at facial expressions, and what he did was he showed participants a large number of faces and then had them rate how trustworthy, competent, likable, aggressive, or attractive each person seemed. And some participants were given a lot of time. They called this the gold standard. And then others were given only about a second or a tenth of a second to make decisions. So not very much time at all. So the correlations made at leisure were made at leisure, and those that made 1/10 of a second are almost as high as the correlation between judgments made at leisure and those made in a full second. So made at leisure means at your own time and stuff. And here you can see the levels. And I think what's fascinating here isn't necessarily, whether they see people as trustworthy or likable more immediately, although that's interesting by itself. What I find particularly fascinating is that there, as I just said, there's not much of a difference between, how long you see a face and make a judgment about one of these characteristics. It's almost automatically the way that this happens. So Todorov and others, did something else. They, kind of went through, looked at all these different pictures they had, and then, maybe the picture, some ethnic group that somebody didn't like, or, whatever, something like that. So they made these computer images of different faces and facial types, and as you can see, there's, different expressions, different jaw sizes, cheek shapes, and so on and so forth. So then what they did was they, showed people these faces, and then had this basically the scale in terms of they measured people basically on two dimensions, positive, negative dimension, trustworthy and untrustworthy, basically down here, and then a power dominance dimension, so who seems more powerful, more dominant, and so on. So you can see, the people that seem very trustworthy are kind of smiling, as the textbook says, they have kind of baby faces, kind of, I guess, little chubbier cheeks and something like that. And then you go to the dominant people, and you see kind of this square jawline tends to be seen as dominant, but also trustworthy. And here you've got the person smiling, and they score high on dominance, but also on trustworthiness. But then over here you've got people who, furrowed brow or something like this, kind of a frown on their face. They seem very dominant, but not very trustworthy. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean, this person could be the most honest, whatever, and actually not very dominant, but our minds tend to treat people that way. And as I'll discuss, societies tend to do that as well. There's this fascinating study where they had they had video of people dancing, but they had their faces blurred. And they asked, people to rate who were the better dancers and so on, and people did that. And it turned out that then when they revealed the faces, the people that were the better dancers had the most symmetrical faces, meaning, their eyes were equal distance apart and so on and so forth. So does that mean that people who have more symmetric features are just, better dancers, can just, do the breakdance better, do the robot better, that sort of thing? No. What it probably means, though, is that, our society tends to view symmetry as being attractive. And so people who are more attractive are likely to go out dancing more. And the more you go out dancing, the better you get at it. And that's probably the reason why those good dancers seem to have symmetric faces. Another key term in social psych, pluralistic ignorance, and I encounter this all the time when I have anytime I ask a basic question. You probably see this in the classroom all the time, where the professor or teacher will say, "So, anybody have any questions?" And you've got all these questions about the material, but you don't want to look like an idiot. You don't want to ask a question that's maybe everybody else understands. No one else is raising their hand, so surely they all must understand it as well. And it turns out that nobody understands it, but nobody just wants to raise their hand. So it's an example of pluralistic ignorance. So this, the emperor has no clothes. Everybody, says that, except, the boy who says, "Hey, the emperor's got no clothes on," that sort of thing. Our information can be misleading. And, we're starting to learn that quite a bit, all the misinformation that we find online and so on. So there is, these sort of stereotypes about different parts of the country that are somewhat accurate, but also, very, very simplistic, and, definitely not, not that realistic, at least not from a sociological perspective. Other things that are interesting, self-fulfilling prophecies. These are when you sort of believe something and this influences your expectations, which then influences behavior, which leads to results which reinforces this belief that you have, the self-fulfilling prophecy. So a self-fulfilling prophecy is this tendency for people to act in ways that bring about the very thing they expect to happen. So you think, "Oh, I'm just not going to do well in social psychology," and you just kind of think that over and over again. And then that starts to actually influence your expectations, and you don't do quite as well, or maybe you do okay, but, it's not fantastic. So then that just reinforces your belief and so on. So self-fulfilling prophecy, you sort of, make the prophecy come true, basically. There's a famous experiment where a number of elementary school teachers were told that aptitude tests had identified a number of students as being very gifted. And it turns out these students weren't necessarily gifted. They were randomly selected. But then, they kind of let the experiment go on for a couple of weeks or whatever it was. And they found that the teachers actually spent more time with those students and led those students to score higher on IQ tests that were administered at the end of the year. So, that's kind of fascinating. You had these students that were chosen at random. They said, "Hey, these are gifted students." The teachers spend more time with them, and, a lot of them are average, below average, whatever. But because they got extra time, they all scored higher on IQ tests. So, imagine if all teachers or professors treated all students as if they were gifted, maybe they would learn more, become better teachers, that sort of thing. In another important study, you had a couple of groups of students here. The students committed a mock crime, not a real one, and the setup was that money was stolen out of some locked classroom lab. And you had another group of students that simply visited the scene of the crime. So these students who visited the scene of the crime were then questioned by other student interrogators who were led to believe by somebody like a teacher or something like that. They were led to believe that the students who just visited the scene of the crime were either more likely to be guilty or innocent. It kind of depended on what they told the interrogators. They kind of, separated them into two groups. And they found that the interrogators who had been basically told that they thought that this one group was guilty, they asked more incriminating questions and basically conducted much more vigorous and aggressive interrogations, which led the suspects to act more defensively. Which seemed to lead to, which led the interrogators to think that they were guilty. So this is just, students in a mock crime, and, granted these students haven't taken courses in, being a detective and things like that. Nevertheless, you can see how when people are made to think in a certain way, how that can influence their behavior and how they treat others as well. And we see this, repeatedly when it comes to police treatment of of Black Americans and others as well, but especially African Americans. So we find that, and we'll get into this in a lot more detail when we talk about stereotypes and stuff, but we find that Black people are, innocent Black people are much more likely to be convicted of crimes than innocent white people. You may or may not have heard. So there was, back in the 1980s, maybe early 1990s, there were these 5 young Black men that were accused of a rape of a white woman in Central Park in New York City. It turns out that they were completely innocent, which was proven years later, but Donald Trump, our current president, wrote a full-page thing in the New York Times saying that they should face the death penalty. Luckily, they, DNA evidence and everything found them innocent later, but imagine if they had been killed, and plenty of people are killed, especially Black people, in this country for crimes that they did not commit. Now, as sort of an aside, you may have heard that guy Kyle Rittenhouse, who shot and killed a number of people, or a couple of people, at the Black Lives Matter protest in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And the response of Donald Trump Jr., the son of the president, was that, well, at 17, people all do dumb things. Not everyone murders other people. And, this is a big difference from the executions that were called for by his father for a rape that was not proven. So we see this coming from the top, from the presidency on down. We're seeing a lot of this intensify. And as I said, we'll get into this in far more detail. As I said, we have misleading first-hand information. We also have misleading second-hand information. There's a lot of this too. So this is, fake news and gossip, and, it's pretty easy for misinformation to fly around right now. And we're seeing this happen right now up in Oregon. There were people from that cult, the conspiracy cult, QAnon, which again we'll talk about later, which is basically a cult. They have been found to spread misinformation that there were no fires, and a number of people in Oregon did not leave their homes. We don't know if that resulted in any deaths yet, but it did at least result in a number of people not taking the problem seriously, or thinking that it was, left-wing mobs that were that were starting it. So a lot of misinformation coming from QAnon, which is becoming very popular within the Republican Party, which is kind of alarming for a major legitimate party to take on such a conspiracy theory. I'm actually going to be calling Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania and asking him what he thinks about this. So why do I mention this again? This is all sort of gossip, conspiracy stuff. I have a lot of know people who are following QAnon, and they're getting all this information about this misinformation, I should say, about these various pedophile rings and so on. And I have students who have actually went into jobs who actually fight sex traffickers around the world. And there's a lot of legitimate places to find information about that than, a source that's mainly built to spread, conspiracy theories. Anyway, I have a pet peeve about conspiracy theories. Okay, ideological distortions. This is something that, you see in the hate book, in the righteous mind book, and that we'll get into again in more detail. But basically, people that are liberal, more conservative, they do actually interpret the world differently. There's these psychological, physiological things that are manifested in political views. One of the biggest distortions in my opinion, in American life over the last 4 decades, essentially my entire life, is the way crime has been covered. So crime rates have been dropping since the 1990s, as I'll show. For a variety of reasons, but crime rates have been dropping quite substantially since the 1990s. However, as you see here, news stories, basically, local news especially, started to increase the number of crime stories, because they found that, crime stories attract attention. They're more interesting than, boring stuff like, pension funds running out and, Social Security in trouble and everyone having to take care of the elderly and, all that boring stuff. Much more interesting to talk about, some murder that happened, even if it's much more rare than, this potential economic crises facing us. Okay, anyway, so local news has destroyed American society, in my view, by local news and national news, by just completely misleading people about the level of crime. And that means that we shovel more and more of our money out of our paychecks and into police departments who are essentially now militarized, even though, as I said, crime has been dropping since 1990. Again, and you can look, though, at people's perceptions. Is there more crime in the U.S. than there was a year ago or less? So back in 1989, you would have had, more crime and so on. But people are recognizing that, but nevertheless, you still get, for whatever reason, and I'm not quite sure what happens here, 2000, 2001, maybe the September 11th attacks, but basically you get people thinking that there's more crime in the U.S., even though the reality is that crime was going up from the 1960s, so about 1990, and then dropped. And that's essentially mostly the result of population demographics. You actually had less young men aged 15 to 25 out on the streets, and so that led to a big drop in crime. Increased prisons. There's some debate about that because we know that also leads to increased recidivism, which means that people go to prison, maybe they're there for some drug charges, but then, to survive in prison, they join a prison gang and then they become violent, that sort of thing. So it's a complex problem, but the main point that I want to make, is that the reality is that property crime and violent crime have gone down. If you take this to, 2019, it still goes down. 2020, we'll see. Obviously, it's gone up a little bit. In terms of the riots, if you take the riots out, I'd be interested to see, if crime has changed at all in terms of the broader trends. As I said, it was going up for a while, then it's going down. To the point that you have the psychologist Steven Pinker writes a book a few years ago called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which comes from a line from a speech by President Abraham Lincoln. And he talks about how violence has been declining over the centuries. He also has a new book out called Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, tends to have a fairly, optimistic view of the world, which is okay. But so we'll talk more about this, but this is again goes along with the trends we see in falling crime rates in the U.S., which, by the way, are also found in most other rich countries, happening at about the same time, even though they have vastly different criminal justice policies. So again, it has more to do with demographic structure than almost anything else. What else can influence, how we interpret the world? Well, how information is presented to us. The primacy, marketers have learned the psychology of colors, for example, and you can, look at those and see how colors how colors mostly affect people. So when we talk about the effects of information, one of the most important things is how it's presented, the order. So there's the primacy effect, and this is the disproportionate influence of a judgment presented first in the body of evidence, as opposed to the recency effect, which is basically, the one that's presented most recently, not necessarily first, though. Sorry about that. Grab some notes here. Okay. So, the famous social psychologist Solomon Asch, you may remember from that line experiment we watched. He did this kind of fascinating study where he got two groups, and he had one group evaluate some hypothetical individual described by the following terms: intelligent, industrious, impulsive, critical, stubborn, and envious. And then, the people had to rate them. So the individual was rated favorably because of the influence of the two positive terms at the beginning of the list. So for the second group, they read the same traits, but in a different order. So if you remember the terms intelligent, industrious, compulsive, critical, stubborn, and envious. But this time they had stubborn and envious at the start, and then intelligence, etc. So that's pretty interesting. So it turns out that, even the same words, if are used to describe someone, the exact same words, people will have a very different perception of that person based upon the order in which the words are used to describe that person. Really kind of fascinating and, kind of alarming in some ways, but such is the case. Other important things. So one of the most important things in social psychology generally is what we call framing. And framing is basically kind of how we choose to describe an issue. So someone who is, say, against abortion, they may decide that, and they did decide that, just saying anti-abortion is not, as powerful enough as kind of framing it as pro-life. Because there you're saying, okay, there's, potentially a living fetus there. That's more powerful than, say, anti-abortion. So framing is huge, and, how you frame anything. So how politicians frame things becomes very important as well. So we have something called construal level framing, and basically what this does, it's a theory of the relationship between psychological distance and abstract thinking. Psychologically distant actions and events are thought about in more abstract terms. Actions and events that are close at hand are thought in more concrete terms. So, very kind of fascinating there. Looking at, let's see. So one kind of interesting study, again, kind of looking similar to the word one, but this has a lot more serious implications. So this study, they did with 400 physicians. And so they asked them if they would recommend surgery or radiation for patients diagnosed with a certain type of cancer. And some of the doctors were told of the previous 100 patients, 90 lived, 68 were still alive after a year, and 34 were still alive after 5 years. So they had a second group, the other half of the physicians, the doctors, and they were given the exact same information, but it was framed differently. So instead of saying, 100 patients, that, out of 100 patients, 90 lived, they start out by saying 10 died, 32 died by the end of the year, and 66 died after 5 years. So in the first study, when they said, 90 lived, 68 still alive after a year, 34 after 5 years, 82% said, yeah, do the surgery. Those are pretty good numbers. But then the second one, where 10 died, 32 died by the end of the year, and 66 died after 5 years, exact same numbers, only 56% of doctors recommended surgery. So almost a 30% difference there, just based on the differences in terms of how the information was framed. So that's kind of alarming because, think about that. Physicians are not necessarily making decisions based upon the rational view of science and medicine, because they're humans, and we all kind of fall victim to some of these framing effects. So anyway, that's temporal framing. Again, is something where you sort of construe events that seem to happen in the past. Other kind of interesting areas here. Confirmation bias. This is probably one of the most important things to know, especially in these days. This is the tendency to test an idea by searching for evidence that supports it. So this is, something everybody on social media should basically be forced to take a class in before posting their views. I know that's sort of a fascistic thing to say, but the problem, with confirmation bias, we're all sort of guilty of it. Some more than others, but especially true when it comes to political or scientific arguments and so on, where basically, if you want to find, say you're a liberal and you want to find information that the Republicans are corrupt and so on, or more corrupt than the Democrats, you'll gather up all this evidence and so on and so forth, and based upon that, they're a completely corrupt party. There's every Republican is corrupt and so on. But then there's a lot of data that suggests the opposite. So that liberal person is basically falling into their confirmation bias. So we see this all the time, and I'd be curious. I'm sure there are many studies about this on social media. I'll go over one in a moment. But, there probably should be more. I have found that people's views don't change too much on social media arguments. Every once in a while somebody may be won over by the other side. Generally, people seem to find links that back up their information, or, ignore the evidence that the other person said. So confirmation is a big problem. So kind of an interesting study that was done on this. So they were looking at tennis and practice. And so what they did was the psychologists had one group of participants determine whether working out the day before an important tennis match makes a player more likely to win. The other group was asked if they make the player more likely to lose. So then they watched the games and stuff. They were, told they were practiced or didn't practice, and so on and so forth. And what you find is that those who were told that they practiced, or those that they told that practiced and won, or practiced and lost, or didn't practice, they basically found that those people, they paid much more attention to what they were basically primed into thinking about. Participants were especially interested in finding out that information that would confirm the proposition that they were investigating. So if they were investigating whether practicing led to more winning, that's what they mostly focused on. So we do tend to, we kind of ignore stuff that doesn't, that we're not maybe as focused on at the moment. There's also something called motivated confirmation bias. We see this quite a bit. There's, this is just a huge issue in politics, like I just said, where we're constantly trying to confirm our own biases and so on. Schemas play an important role. We've talked about that. Retrieval is the way that we extract information from our memory. And I'll be honest, since I was sick, my retrieval has not been as great, I've noticed. I hope it returns and not some long-term thing. But anyway, it might be. So anyway, schemas, they guide our inferences and our construals about how we see the world, and so on. So just a kind of a classic experiment that was done on a wife and husband, and what they did. So they have this couple that gets together. They have, in this one study, they had students watch a video of a husband and wife having dinner together. Half of them were told that the wife was a librarian, and the other half that she was a waitress. And then in the quiz, the researchers asked whether the woman was drinking wine, the librarian stereotype, or beer, the waitress stereotype, and whether she had received a history book or a romance novel as a gift. So just you have a couple here, he's saying something along the lines of, oh, I'm really into plaid, and she's saying, oh, I love plaid design as well. And then you've got another couple here having dinner, back here they're drinking wine here, so the stereotype for being a librarian. Here they're drinking beer, the stereotype for being a waitress. And he's saying, hey, honey, I bought you a shirt. It's a plaid shirt. And I've met this other couple, and they want to hang out. And she's taking a drink of her beer, saying, I don't know where this is going. Okay, so the stereotype again, the students who watched this video of these people having their dinner, they had to, try and figure out whether she had received a history book or a romance novel. When the history book was supposed to be more something that a librarian was more likely to check out. And I would suggest reading The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and The End of an Empire for a better book on the end of the Roman Empire. Anyway, then the waitress stereotype was, that they would be drinking beer, and that they would be, if they got a gift book, and there was a book, it would probably be a romance novel. So the students who thought the woman was a librarian recalled librarian consistent information more accurately than librarian inconsistent information, meaning that, they thought that, okay, she's a librarian, so she'll probably be more sophisticated, so she's probably drinking wine and reading about Rome. And those who thought about the waitress thought, oh, well, she's probably, less educated and drinking beer and reading some trashy romance novel. And, those are all just kind of stereotypes that people make. It could be completely wrong, though. The librarian might love romance novels and drink beer, and the waitress might drink wine and have a love of history or something like that. So anyway, we see how some of these things can play out. Oh, and here's the whole description of it. So if you want to go over it, it also talks about it in your book as well. In another early study, students participated in what they thought were two unrelated participants. In the first one, they viewed a number of traits that were projected on a screen as part of a perception experiment. Half of the participants were shown the words adventurous, self-confident, independent, and persistent. Half were shown the words reckless, conceited, aloof, and stubborn. And then they were supposed to say whether they like this guy named Donald or not. And, Donald were that basically those that saw the words adventurous basically formed more favorable impressions of this guy named Donald. Other kind of fascinating study, I think. So I don't know quite how they did this, but they found that in some wine cellars and wine stores and so on, that if the place is playing some German music, German folk music or Kraftwerk, that people are more likely to buy German flavored wine or beer. That's kind of weird. Maybe that's just something, maybe it would happen if they were playing anything. Well, they've tried it with French music as well. Some traditional French here and Daft Punk, some more modern French. Then they find that when they play French music, people are more likely to buy French wine. So if they play, I guess, the Beach Boys or something from California, maybe people buy California wine, which is the best. No. I lived in California for a while. I went to Sonoma State University, where it's in wine country, and they have different plazas and halls named after different types of wine. But everyone there is fleeing the fires right now, unfortunately. Okay, other aspects. We tend to be pretty bad at at estimating our own contributions. Oftentimes we do a worse job than we may think. And again, that's just, something that's generally natural. It's kind of a funny meme that kind of explains some of this stuff. And kind of an interesting, looking at some of this and kind of how people view themselves and their activities and so on. Husbands and wives were asked, to estimate a percentage of work that they do. The wife said she does about 100%. She buys the food, prepares it, clears the table, and washes the dishes. The husband said that he does about 25% of the work. And he listed one thing: feeding the cats. So they have either he doesn't really understand statistics, or they have a very unequal work relationship there. Now, I'm going to stop in a moment, but when we return, let me go here first. I think I mentioned this, priming, when you get people to think about things first. So you may remember that study I mentioned earlier on, where they had students come in and take a quick, some survey about something like their dorm life or whatever it might be. But then they had some questions that primed them to think about the elderly, like, do you spend much time with the elderly, and how do you like your grandparents, that sort of thing. And they found that the students that had questions that were that primed them to think about the elderly, and they found that they walked slower down the hallway when they left the experiment, rather than those who didn't, who weren't primed with words regarding the elderly. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. So one of the things, though, that we're going to talk about next time is what we call heuristics, and how it is that we're able to develop these skills and thoughts without putting much or any conscious thought into them. So maybe some of you play baseball. So I'm sure those of you who are pitchers and, can throw a curveball, I'm sure before you, threw a curveball, you worked out the all the trigonometry and everything that's, that helps you understand how a ball curves, right? I'm sure you did that. No, that's not. That's probably the very, very rare person that learns how to throw a curveball that way, if ever. The point here is that, just as in baseball with a the physics of a curveball, there's sort of social physics that happen when we make decisions. And we will get into that in more detail next time. It's kind of a big topic and I don't want to dive into it till we have time next time. So next time I'll finish up on this chapter, on chapter 4. I'll also go over briefly the application module, because remember you have an application module quiz that'll be opening up on Friday and will be due the following Friday. The application module is on the social psychology of health, and that will be good because it will be a good sort of segue from this into the other part of the lecture on Thursday, where I'll be talking about sort of the political physiology, political psychology and stuff. So all of this kind of comes together very well. So we should have a good class on Thursday. The lecture will probably be a bit longer then. And so, try to post during the class time, but if you can post, as soon as you can afterward, that's good as well. And I will also be posting the study guide for the exam on Thursday, and we'll talk about that and send out emails. All right, well, have a good Tuesday, everyone.